evening, everyone, and welcome to the President's Endowed Plenary Lecture Series. Before we begin, I'd like to recognize Elaine Sisman, who with her husband Marty Fritzen has created the fund that makes these lectures possible. Elaine, professor at Columbia, president of the Society from 2005 to 2006, and honorary member since 2022, served over the course of her career as member of the ANS Board of Directors and member and chair of several of our most important committees. Marty also generously donated his time and skills as financial advisor to the Society for many years. Together, they surely deserve to be honored as an AMS lifetime power couple. Thank you, Elaine, and we love you, Marty. Turning now to our lecture this evening, we're honored to welcome Philip J. Deloria, Leverett Saltonstall Professor of History at Harvard University. A member of the Dakota Sioux Tribe and the first tenured Native American professor on Harvard's Faculty of Arts and Sciences, Phil is one of the foremost scholars of Native American history and culture. The courses he has taught include American Indian history, environmental history, the American West, and American Studies methods, as well as food studies, big history, and songwriting. He comes from a remarkable family with a legacy of activism, scholarship, and public service. His great-grandfather, the Dakota leader Tipisaha, also known as Black Lodge or the Reverend Philip Joseph Deloria, was highly respected for his leadership in the Indian community and as an Episcopal priest, bridging traditional Dakota values with Christianity in ways that supported and uplifted his community during a period of intense cultural upheaval after the Civil War. His memory is honored with a statue in the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C. Phil's father, Vine Deloria Jr., was a pioneering Native American writer, scholar, and activist, best known for his book, Custer Died for Your Sins, which became a cornerstone of Indigenous rights advocacy and helped propel the American Indian Movement, AIM. Vine Deloria Jr. and his wife Barbara, encouraging a deep engagement with both Indigenous and American histories, profoundly shaped Phil's propensity for an intellectual and activist life. Phil's formative years in Austin, a city, as you know, known for its progressive and artistic culture, exposed him to diverse communities and ideas that would later inspire his work on identity and representation. They also saw the development of skills as a trombonist, singer, guitarist, and songwriter. And he also was a rocker, and when I couldn't get your attention just now, he gave me some advice about how to use the microphone. Phil's work explores intersections of American Indian and U.S. history, often highlighting Indigenous voices and examining the complexities of cultural identity, colonialism, and sovereignty. His books, Playing Indian and Indians in Unexpected Places, reflect on Native American representations in American culture and reveal often overlooked Indigenous contributions. In Indians in Unexpected Places, he examines the ways Native American artists have defied stereotypes and pushed cultural boundaries, including their engagement with genres of music from jazz to opera. The important role music has served in Phil's life and thought is reflected in his writings on the intersection of music, performance, and Indigenous identity. His scholarship considers how music serves as a means of cultural expression and resistance for Native people, contributing to broader discussions of representation and modernity. His mythology highlights the adaptability of Native musicians who blend traditional sounds with contemporary musical forms, challenging common narratives around so-called authenticity and indigenous creativity. Finally, Phil is a beautiful writer who weaves a personal emotional response into intellectually stimulating narratives ranging from the death of Jerry Jeff Walker, a Texas singer-songwriter, to the battered guitar of the Indigenous artist T.C. Canny. This evening, he shares his insight into Native American music through the lens of the 2017 documentary film, Rumble, The Indians Who Rock the World. And I will just say that we won't take questions and answers after the talk tonight, but Phil and his wife will be here. His wife, what's her name? Peggy. And we invite, stand up, Peggy. We'll invite you to introduce yourself and to ask questions or make comments on his talk, and to really welcome him. We've talked a lot about becoming a more welcoming society, so give them a hug or a handshake. So thank you all for being here, and please join me in welcoming Philip J. Deloria.
How mi tako yepi yuha chante washte na peche yuzepelo Phil Deloria imachi yapi. Just saying, I greet you all with a good heart. I'm Phil Deloria, and thank you so much, Georgia, for the wonderful introduction. Okay, what I was telling Georgia was this is the Shure SM58. It's the classic rock and roll microphone, and you do kind of have to eat it a little bit, and so I'm going to bend over to to do that. I am so pleased and honored to be with you here tonight, and to sort of honor and recognize the practice, right, of the AMS of inviting music-adjacent people to speak at the annual meeting. And I'm particularly grateful, Georgia, for your kind hosting and your hospitality. The chance to chat with you all comes at a curious moment for me, because while, yes, I've always thought of myself as having at least a tiny part of my life situated in music, I have of late been living as someone who is actually art history adjacent, and tonight I'll be fixing on at least one moment when these two peripheries of mine, art and music, come together. But first I want to just begin with a story. Fingers crossed. It's June 1932. My grandfather and grandmother are driving my great-aunt Ella's old car north from Nebraska to the Pine Ridge Reservation. They are in the final hours of their honeymoon, and things are about to get real. Their wedding has come after a year's separation, she in New York, he in South Dakota, which had followed a whirlwind 3-day meetup and proposal the previous June. They did not know each other well. As my grandmother remembered it, my grandfather was reluctant to take her to their new home, which had been his quarters during that previous year. It was a converted garage with 2 army cots shoved together, no running water, and a privy out back. And so, delaying the inevitable, my grandfather drove around Pine Ridge singing. And the singing matters in this story, both in its meaning and its practice. The Dakota and Lakota men, of which my grandfather was one, have made and used songs frequently to celebrate some achievement, to punctuate a story, to convey a spiritual reality, to prepare for their death, to call on higher powers. It made sense for my grandfather to steel himself with song, since my white, elite East Coast grandmother was most definitely going to be shocked by the garage, a sad annex to the Episcopal Mission Church at Pine Ridge. As a native missionary for the church, my grandfather had grown up in a Dakota version of the Christian hymn tradition. Indeed, the Episcopal Church proudly celebrated the conversion of his father, the Philip J. Deloria, for whom I'm named, with person who Georgia mentioned, that his conversion came through the power of song, a piece of music so divine it brought the supposedly heathen Indian to Christ. In that story, as the church told it, my great-grandfather, Tipi Sapa, or Black Lodge, was passing by the mission church at Yankton one Sunday when he heard the strains of a hymn called "Guide Me, O Thou Great Jehovah," which I suspect some of you know, and was so struck by its beauty that he returned for the next several Sundays, hoping to hear that hymn again, or perhaps something like it. The missionary, Joseph Cook, took notice of this musical lurker and used the hymn to lure Tipi Sapa not simply into the church, but eventually into the clergy, one of the very first Dakota men to be ordained in the Episcopal Church. That first cohort of Dakota ministers, there were 7 of them. They loved the hymn tradition, and at the annual convocations, quartets and congregations would compete with one another, singing hymns at each other. They sang the hymns loudly, and when I say loudly, I mean really, really loudly, and often with a Dakota nasal inflection that must have challenged non-Dakota listeners by what they were hearing. These were people who were built for performance in the out of doors, and they carried that style with them into the church. But my grandfather was not singing hymns as he drove around Pine Ridge. Even in his early years, he was a collector of older song and story. He had been raised in an Ihoktawan family and learned the songs and tales of the Middle Missouri River. But he'd grown up at Standing Rock, and so also learned the ways of those more northerly people, the Miniconjus and the Hunkpapas. And during his time at Pine Ridge and later Rosebud reservations, he gathered up stories from the western people, the Oglalas and the Brulés. As a missionary minister, he spent hours driving a decrepit car between backcountry chapels, and he had developed his own version of an indigenous road music. He would lean his left arm out of the car, and he would pound on the door with his fist or his open palm, creating this resonant, steely drum beat for his voice, and then he would sing songs kind of like this. Hatapo kiae wae, hatapo kiae wae, masawa kiae wae, chate no me wae, hatapo kiae wae, hatapo. Well, it's not hard to think that on that June day he sang like a warrior heading off for battle and in some fear of my grandmother to give himself a bit of courage. My grandfather and my 2 great aunts, they were lovely women, were intercultural figures who knew how to get the most out of the multiple worlds they inhabited. An outstanding athlete, my grandfather lettered in 4 sports: football, baseball, lacrosse, and track during his 4 years at St. Stephen's College, which is now known to us as Bard College. It's a real center, actually, for Native arts and culture today. And he was an honorable mention All-American in football in 1922. That was at a time, as I've written about previously, when an Indian athlete was an object of fascination and appeal, when Native Olympians took home medals for the United States, when the 1913 World Series had not 1 token Indian player, but 3 great ones, 2 of whom were destined for the Hall of Fame, and when the National Football League had an all-Indian team and a Native American president in the form of the athletic hero Jim Thorpe. That curious, too easily forgotten world extended beyond athletics to musical, theatrical, filmic, and dance performance. Will Rogers was a radio star, the Osage Ballerinas were the toast of the town, Molly Spotted Elk, Luther Standing Bear, and dozens of other Indians appeared on the silver screen. They were part of a singular moment in American history, when the desire of white cultural consumers for some piece of authentic Indian life, an anti-modern thirst for Indian primitivism, when that opened up opportunities for Native people to create and recreate themselves within an American cultural world. This world is too easily forgotten because that window, opened by modernist primitivism, it didn't stay open for very long. And indeed, as the athletes and dancers and singers and actors watched their moment pass, they were left to puzzle over a question asked many times since then. Did non-Native interest in Native life just hit a high point in a cycle to be followed by an inevitable loss of interest? Or did we somehow create a new plateau, new possibilities on which we could build? Are we moving forward in some way? Or are we just back to a racialist and racist square one, starting over from scratch the next time someone decides that Indian people are interesting one more time? The early 20th century, and then an effort to terminate Indians. The Red Power embrace of the 1960s, And then the retrenchments of the 70s and 80s, the rise of New Age mysticism and Santa Fe style that followed, and then the seemingly inevitable fallow period after. The 2017 film, Rumble, The Indians Who Rocked the World, pondered that question yet again, revisiting another world too easily forgotten, a world in which American Indian musicians took to many different stages across most of the major genres of 20th century popular music. Had they been known as Indians and then forgotten also as Indians? Just part of that long cycle of attention and dismissal? Or might the film itself, through its historical excavation of iconic figures and familiar sounds, create a kind of a plateau, a new cultural imaginary in which a general audience might recognize and value a long and deep tradition of Indian people in popular music? Well, the film begins with Link Wray's 1958 song, Rumble. It's an extremely simple chordal instrumental that was revolutionary for its early use of distortion and tremolo. Guitar players will recognize this. He's playing an open D chord and an open E chord. Dun, dun, dun. Except he's got his distortion, he's got his amp turned up to 11, as they say in Spinal Tap, and he's got his tremolo turned up. So the song's rough sound and the title, reminiscent of a gang fight, it was claimed, led Rumble to be banned from several radio markets, even as it climbed to number 16 on the pop charts and number 11 on the R&B chart. That's kind of cool, I think. It's not often, or maybe ever, except in this case, that an instrumental track gets banned from the radio. So the film stakes a claim that Ray, of Shawnee descent, basically invented the rock and roll power chord, enabling garage rock, metal, punk, pretty much any other form that thrives on distorted guitars. The argument is supported by a series of interviews from people who confirm this argument: Martin Scorsese, Stephen Van Zandt, Iggy Pop, Steven Tyler, Robbie Robertson, all of whom testify to Link Wray's importance. And in the film, it's not just the distortion guitar. When it comes to jazz stylings, Rumble makes a similar case for the Coeur d'Alene singer Mildred Bailey. Tony Bennett observes in the film that he listened to Bailey for years and essentially learned his craft from her. The film notes Jimi Hendrix's Afro-Cherokee origins and his awareness and embrace of his indigenous heritage. It lingers on the 70s native band Redbone, which we will recognize from Come and Get Your Love from Guardians of the Galaxy, but also a series of political songs such as Wovoka and We Were All Wounded at Wounded Knee. And it closes, the film does, with an extended riff on the Apache Pueblo metal drummer Randy Castillo, who played with Ozzy Osbourne, among others. There's a long love note in the film to the Kiowa Comanche guitar master Jesse Ed Davis, who played on seemingly every major rock album of the 60s and 70s, and whose 1986 collection with the American Indian Movement activist and survivor John Trudell nailed down an innovative blues and spoken word genre in powerful ways. Haudenosaunee musician Robbie Robertson makes an appearance, and we are reminded of how much the unique sound of the band might have owed some debt, through him, to native sonic traditions. And perhaps most significant, Rumble frames the early Afro-Choctaw bluesman Charlie Patton as a foundational figure, arguing the case for indigenous influence in the early blues, and thus all that follows. So you add it up. Blues, rock, pop, jazz, rhythm and blues, Americana, metal. This film was literally swinging for the fences. Well, my father was born in 1933, a year or so after my grandparents made their way to that repurposed garage in Pine Ridge, South Dakota. By the time of his birth, they had been transferred, mercifully from my grandmother, it turns out, to the St. Catherine's Episcopal Church in the nearby town of Martin, South Dakota, which was a mixed-blood town. Unlike the reservation agency towns, Martin had been founded by multiracial people who were, amidst the tensions of the time and place, beginning to imagine themselves in new ways. They were, in a sense, blues people of a different sort, primed for Rumble's reading of a complicated, multiple musical kinds of origins that took indigenousness seriously. In the words of a later anthropologist, they saw themselves as 150% people. So their white neighbors who took blood very seriously thought that it was cool that these mixed blood people were superior to the full blood people. What they didn't recognize was these mixed blood people actually thought they were superior to white people as well. So my father grew up in this world, listening not so much to Lakota music, but more to the sounds of country music radio, though of course he got the hymn tradition every Sunday, whether he liked it or not. His hero was Gene Autry, and he had some musical dreams of his own. There are a few photographs of him as a young man with a guitar, circa 1950. When he left home in the early 1950s to attend the Colorado School of Mines, he flunked out, but only because he fell in with a collection of guitar-toting bohemians with a penchant for all-night diners, folk music, and drag racing on West Colfax in Denver. My father's secret musical history, unknown to me until much later, meant that all that I needed to do was show an interest in the guitar, and the traffic lights sitting at the intersection of his own dreams and his sense of parental obligation would turn bright green in every direction, every time. And indeed, I think that when that moment finally arrived, he was quite relieved. Because like so many kids, I had found happiness, or at least something good to do, in the school music program. I started on the clarinet in 3rd grade. A few years later, a trip to the orthodontist changed my future, as my parents were informed that the instrument was levering out my overbite, but that perhaps a brass instrument might push my teeth in just about right. So the rental clarinet went back to the music store, and in a time-honored tradition in which I would later participate, there was a band teacher who begged that I play anything but the trumpet. He would have loved me to play tuba, but he was willing to settle for the trombone. As you can see, I was a goofball with the trombone, playing it with my feet in the high school talent show. I loved the trombone, and it at least liked me, if not loved me. But my dad never saw it as a particularly charismatic instrument. I should say I do have some black slides up here where I'm just not illustrating all the time. So this is one of those moments. As I followed a familiar pathway, first chair, solo competition, all-state orchestra, and then a music performance major at the University of Colorado, my dad's eyes pretty much glazed over. But on the day when I signed up for a junior high guitar class, he sprang into uncharacteristic parental action. Pretty much the only time he set foot in my school was to rush in on the first day as I sat guitarless while others sat with their guitars, and then hand over to me a lovely little harmony guitar in a chipboard case. Later, in company with the Denver guitar designer and builder Harry Fleischman, we would spend a fabulous day wandering through the pawn shops of Colfax, returning home with an Ovation Electric and a vintage Sears Silvertone amp shown here, the latter of which still actually sits in my basement, unfortunately unplayed. My father's eclectic network would land me a great summer job as the all-purpose runner at David Ferretta's guitar shop on South Broadway and at his folk coffee house, the Global Village, where periodically during the hoot night or a lull in the action, I could hop on the stage and play a tune or two. My dad's pals included the deep-voiced Lakota singer Floyd Red Crow Westerman, and the Austin music scene fixtures like the balladeer Bobby Bridger, redneck rock songwriters Jerry Jeff Walker and Michael Burton, and the talented, coveted sidemen of the Los Gonzo Band. My dad was one of the main architects of the contemporary understanding of Native American sovereignty. He wrote over 30 books, and he did a lot for American Indian peoples. But in his own mind, his finest moment might have been this one, backstage at Red Rocks at a Jerry Jeff Walker concert, as Gary P. Nunn takes his picture on stage, looking perhaps a little too comfortable with Jerry Jeff guitar slung over his shoulder as the crowd files in. My dad had this blown up into a large poster, which he hung on the wall in our house. Well, these are the same years during which my grandfather sent us a mysterious box of odd drawings. These had been the work of his sister, Susan Deloria, who had adopted for herself the name Mary Sully. Sully, as I'll mostly refer to her now, had spent most of her life traveling with her older sister, Ella Deloria, an ethnographer and linguistic anthropologist who had worked for and with some of the major figures in the field. Franz Boas, Ruth Benedict, and Margaret Mead were her sort of closest colleagues. Frighteningly shy, Mary Sully struggled to make an independent life for herself, and the two sisters ended up as lifelong companions. She died in 1963, and the box of drawings ended up with Ella. Ella died in 1971, and the drawings made their way to my grandfather. And he sent them to my mother, a librarian, with the vague admonition to do for them whatever it was that librarians did, like catalog them or something. Well, the box held 134 three-part drawings, almost all of which had a name attached. They were, it seemed, a unique genre of complicated semi-abstract portraiture. The first one out of the box, Alice Fazende. Never heard of her. And then Jessie Crawford. Ditto. A parade of unfamiliar names emerged from the box until we started to bump into things like Bing Crosby and Henry Ford and Franklin Delano Roosevelt and others. The drawings were of colored pencil and wax crayon on paper neither large nor small, about 18 by 12 inches, and they all followed the same pattern. A top panel, which had aspects of representational imagery, was taped to a middle panel, which made a design out of the top panel's colors and icons, which was then taped in turn to a smaller bottom panel, which transformed those themes and those colors into something like Indian designs, kinda, sorta. And once you figured out who the people were, that top panel, which was sort of symbolic and sort of representational and sort of abstract, would take on new meanings. So when I realized that Jessie Crawford was an organist, the poet of the organ, they called him in late 20s and 30s, suddenly this interesting image started to make sense. Well, of course, it's a keyboard, not laid out as a keyboard, but wrapped around into a circle. And these things look like the organ pedals of an organ to me. And suddenly you see organ pipes up in the kind of edges and the corners. And where those pipes are, you see color, right, representing sound and music. And then in the second one, you can actually imagine an organ playing and this sort of explosion of sound happening. And in the bottom one, it sort of turns into kind of like a sort of Art Deco-y kind of stained glassy sort of thing, which is all about sound, if you take color as sound, right? So this is the kind of work that she was doing. Now, my dad seemed to feel about these drawings the same way he felt about the trombone. And so my mother squirreled them away for some 3 decades. Sometime after my dad passed in 2006, or 2005 rather, we got them back out. And my efforts to make sense of them have been going on ever since. Naively, I first approached museum curators who reminded me that their email inboxes are full of queries from people who had once found a box of their psychologically challenged relatives' drawings in the basement and somehow imagined it deserved a space on their museum's walls. If you think it's worth our time, they said, prove it. And thus this book, published in 2019, which seems to have done the necessary work. Those early moments have now given way to new curatorial partners, including Sylvia Yount and Patricia Merriquin-Norby, who have curated a solo exhibition of Mary Sully's work at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And I have to say, it's a sweet kind of revenge. I stand in the gallery, and I'm sometimes swept into existential crisis or maybe amazement, that this utterly anonymous and yet undeniably brilliant artist should have left this mortal coil thinking that her work was all for naught, that no one would ever see it. And yet, it now hangs on the walls at the Met. Like, how is such a thing possible? Well, didn't Rumble share a kind of similar goal? My disciplinary, canonical argument for Mary Sully went something like this, that there was and is a category called Native American art that has an independent existence. It's sovereign art in that sense, living in a conversation among Native artists and critics, and then, from that ground, inviting in other audiences, including non-Native art historians and critics. At the same time, though, Native American art is, by definition, American art. And so it also belongs in the classic canonical discussions about modernism, its periodization, the meanings of its mid-century transformations, the place of abstraction and technique and concept, its alternative and its global forms. And indeed, Mary Sully's art, produced mostly during the 1930s, is rather well suited to advance a discussion of the American canon. Here's her version of Gertrude Stein. It seems to integrate and to bridge earlier modernist influences, knitting the sensibilities of the teens and the 1920s together with those of the Depression years, while also then pointing to new forms of abstraction. It questions Americanist periodizations, and I think it literally destroys the paradigms that have defined Native American art and art history, These center around the traditionally themed flat background works that were taking place and emerging in Oklahoma and New Mexico. So it's a great thing to think with, right, this art. I sometimes sort of name her as like the Hilma af Klint of Indian country, the Emily Dickinson of Indian country. Those are probably a little too elevated, but I think the ideas are similar, actually. So Rumble, I think, suggested something similar, that while there were many native musics, my grandfather's door-pounding old-style songs, historic and newly crafted powwow musics, medicine songs, both composed and resurrected, we were also called to place a cohort of native musicians into the wider framework of American popular music, and maybe not just popular music, and so reimagine guiding concepts and paradigms. And I think Rumble sought to make this claim through 4 distinct arguments. First, there's a reclamation argument that is, I think, at heart historical. Indian players have been much more present in popular music than anyone has ever imagined, and it is time that we reclaim and acknowledge them. Second, an innovation argument that I think is somewhat canonical. That is to say, Indian players were not simply present. They created important new sounds and strategies that we need to honor. Link Wray invented the power chord, and the world has never been the same. Robbie Robertson led the band into Americana music, and the world has never been the same, and so on. Then third, there is a representation argument that is political and theoretical. Indian musicians created their own sounds while also playing with the sonic pictures of Indians and Indianness that were floating around in the minds of their audiences. They represented, in complex ways, ideas and realities of native life, and they challenged ideologies, discourses, and stereotypes. And then finally, there's a stylistic argument. Mildred Bailey's slippery way of singing across the beat was indigenous. She saw it that way herself. And her style shaped the ways that Tony Bennett sang. Analyzing his own stylistic moves, he acknowledged that genealogy, and the world has never been the same. More to the point, the stylistic elements legible in the argument about the blues might be shared, mixed, overlapping, blended, hybridized with indigenous elements, a key part of that mix. Those vocal figures we have traditionally mapped as field hollers and chants, the film suggests, also sound elements of the native musics of the Southeast. The high to low melodic direction, the minor thirds, the polyrhythmic elements, the slidey semitones, the melismas, these things are demonstrated strikingly in the film in a challenging section in which the Tuscarora singer Pura Fay sings Indian over the blues. One quite literally hears multiple possibilities, or at least multiple arguments, that are sounding simultaneously. So the film, in other words, disrupts what we can think of as a familiar black-white binary, in which musical exchange is destined to be pretty much only a two-way street. A limited musical color palette in which black people invent most of the good stuff and white people learn it, domesticate it, appropriate it, take it. Indians, it suggests, were there too. And so what do we do with that familiar binary? Likewise, Rumble disrupts a different binary, Indian-white, which, except perhaps in ethnomusicological circles, has maybe not had the same traction in American musical culture, or in American culture in general, which tends to privilege black-white relations. We've come these days to explain the frequent absence of the indigenous through theories of settler colonialism, which emphasize an imperative, a settler imperative, toward elimination and erasure. At best, Native people, cultures, and histories are contained in a kind of hazy folkloric past. At worst, they're actively forgotten. Well, with Link Wray in the lead, Rumble advises audiences otherwise, that a key element of white guy rock, the distorted power chord, was first crafted by a Native person. And we might not think that much about a third binary, black-native, but there is one, constructed theoretically around Afro-pessimism on the one hand and a rigidified settler colonial theory on the other. Uninterested in the technical debates and perhaps wary of its own tendency to dip into indigenous essentialisms as opposed to arguments about style and strategy, Rumble takes pains to remind us of the salience and mutuality of this relation. It may be a plateau upon which things could grow. Are the Mardi Gras Indians of New Orleans really Indians? They are in this film, at least in part. What's the relation between blackness and Indianness in Jimi Hendrix's racial subjectivity? nicely integrated? What's the nature of the musical sympathy between Taj Mahal and Jesse Ed Davis? How should we see Afro-Native people like Charlie Patton? Should we try to disentangle blues elements and put them back into boxes and categories? This seems like a fool's errand. Indeed, what can we say about Link Wray himself? Was he a classic Southerner who claimed just a bit of Indian blood? Or was he a guy with a deeply Shawnee sense of himself? Or was he one of those 150% mixed blood types you could find up in South Dakota? Mary Sully's art offers a piercing reminder of the traps and challenges of binaries and categorizations. She grew up in a native world and a churchy world, wearing moccasins and a dress to the mission school where she learned to sew and Latin. Her art was both deeply grounded in native life and radically cosmopolitan. This is one of my very favorite ones of her, of hers, Florence Ziegfeld. And it's almost like she had found this kind of birthday cake celebration and literally reproduced it. I don't think that's the case, but it feels like it. Her art rested heavily on Dakota visual vocabularies, the spatial patterns, squares and rotationally symmetrical medallions that were enabled by the quillwork tradition, the diamonds and triangles so prominent in beadwork and in quilting, the floral designs of the woodland peoples, the color palette, red, green, blue, and yellow, of the rawhide parfleche design tradition. At the same time, a look at her work reveals a capacious visual world of stained glass windows, Art Deco curves and faux Egyptian hieroglyphics, textile design, arts and crafts woodsiness and Art Nouveau florals, Sunday comics, and Rorschach tests. The Busby Berkeley musicals, the modernist techniques of Aaron Douglas and Diego Rivera. Along with that, the impulse to record abstract personality found in artists such as Charles Demuth, Francis Picabia, and Marius de Zayas. Her interest in culture and personality anthropology, which was brought home every night by her sister Ella, who was in the thick of it, seems to have predated Ruth Benedict's earliest formations of the idea. So both Benedict and Sully were focused on, I think, separate paths in a way that it did intersect, focused on a cultural dialectic in which cultures both had personalities and shaped the personalities of their subjects. Sully studied individual people closely, but the aggregate of her project offered an aesthetic portrait of a culture, the American popular culture of the late 1920s, 30s, and early 40s. She was a reverse ethnographer of America and an anti-primitivist of the first order. In that aggregate portrait, music and musicians came to the fore. She cared about opera and pop music, church organs, and marching bands. She made personality portraits for at least 15 musicians and many, many people who were sort of, music adjacent. Film personalities and producers, dancers, talent show hosts. And these works suggest a breaking not only of cultural and social categories, but literally of the physiological experience of the senses, sound and color perception in a kind of synesthesic way. So the notes and colors so often combine to offer pictures of musical performance. And I thought I would just show you a couple of examples. So John Philip, for marching band people, I have to say, when Georgia sort of spoke into the microphone, I could tell like this was a room of musicians because it's that moment, right, when the conductor goes like this, and you're like, I dare not speak. You all got very, very quiet very quickly. So John Philip Sousa, right, as you can see, the sort of the sousaphone, his kind of signature thing. You can see the notes arranged in the form of a marching band on a green football field. You can see how it transforms in the middle panel into a kind of beautiful sousaphone pattern, and then turns into this really interesting actual figure ground kind of thing. Is it a box? Is it another box? Always maintaining the sort of sense of the music, right, that goes with it. And because he was so attached to the University of Illinois marching band, put in the colors, right, of that university. Or this one, Mildred Dilling, who was a harpist And you can see here, right, that her magical colored fingers are literally playing on the string. And then in the second, that pattern is transformed into kind of one of those beautiful things that harpists do, right, where they kind of... And then at the bottom, you can actually see sort of the curve of the harp in an Art Deco kind of pattern and color. So again, this sort of sense that particularly in the top one, right, in the ways that color and music are completely going together. This is probably my favorite one in the entire collection, Lawrence Tibbett. I had the hardest time making sense of this because it is a figure ground illusion in the top panel. I could only see it as a kind of humanoid trilobite figure with these two kind of pink eyes and these arms with yellow hands sticking out. I just couldn't see it any other way until diving deeper into the history of Lawrence Tibbett, who was a singer, kind of crossover singer, very active in sort of music organizing. But apparently had a little cabin in a place called Temescal Canyon outside of Los Angeles, which had a little amphitheater, a little stage, and he would go and he'd stand on the stage in this canyon and he would sing, and the notes would echo out of the canyon, and suddenly I realized that I was seeing it completely backward. That trilobite is actually negative empty space. It's the empty space of the canyon, and suddenly you can see sedimentary rocks, the interior of the canyon, the notes echoing out the Pacific Ocean, right, and the sort of hills around Santa Monica. And then, oddly, in this middle pattern, her early work really tried to make these into design patterns, commercial design patterns. And then there's a moment where she's like, screw that, I'm just going to make art. And so she does. So you can see a kind of camera obscura figure here, right? Within each of these notes, which is a kind of beautiful Easter egg thing, you can see the ocean, the sedimentary rock. She's literally flipped the picture upside down and condensed it into these tiny little things. And it just makes me wonder, like, what was going through her head, right? The imaginary that was happening here. And then in the bottom panel, literally the explosion of an operatic note, right, coming out of someone's mouth and into a canyon. I just think it's fantastically interesting and beautiful and quite smart. And then this one, a church organist, where, you know, she is literally sort of giving us the pipes of the organ and giving us the notes that are emerging from the organ, but also showing us the notes that had just sounded a little earlier and that sounded a little earlier before that, and that were now echoing and vibrating around the sort of, you know, the roof, the ceiling of the church, which then gets converted again into these beautiful kinds of patterns. So like my grandfather and my father, my great aunt, of course, did not escape the allure of the Episcopal Church and its hymn tradition. And I just want to sort of flag this one because I hope someday, I've been talking about this for a long time with my friend John Carlos Perea of the University of Washington, who's an amazing traditional singer, jazz bass player, expert on the Indian flute. We talked about trying to reconstruct something of a melody from those notes emanating right from the organ pipes across time and then using it as a basis for a composition that John Carlos will, of course, do because he's got the chops in these ways that I don't. He's one of the many amazing native performers working today. And I think that might send us back to thinking about what a Rumble 2.0 might look like, right? 7 years later, how do we think about this film? So the film's four argumentative structures arrange themselves in what I find to be a pretty unstable kind of analytical hierarchy. There's nothing particularly challenging, for instance, about a reclamation argument, right? Historians, we've been doing this for a really, really long time. It's so characteristic of a kind of genial, additive sort of multiculturalism. It's cool, unthreatening, familiar. What some Native folks have called Columbusing, right? That satisfying discovery by the wider world of buried histories that Native communities have known all along. The contribution argument is a little more challenging because how easy is it really to isolate a particular moment or individual and make a tenable claim to earth-shaking innovation? I think it's not by accident that the film is called Rumble, because Link Wray offers the most compelling case for this kind of analysis. Distortion plus tremolo plus style equals power chord. That is indeed something. As Jack Hamilton has observed, Ray's innovations were roughly akin to being one of the first paintings to feature paint. When Ray pokes a pencil through a studio speaker to demonstrate to a record executive how he wants his music to be heard, it only confirms the claim. He knew exactly what he was up to. But was Jesse Ed Davis, great as he was, a player who radically changed music, or was he just a really good studio musician who had a really good road career until the drugs brought him down? The style argument sits at either the top or the bottom of the hierarchy, depending on how you construct it, because I think it's the hardest argument to make. Demanding a kind of isolable indigenous quality that can be traced as it moves through culture and performance situations. So how to define such qualities historically rather than through essentialisms, which is always the danger here, I think. Can they ever be isolated and made visible? Mildred Bailey pointed proudly to stylistic elements she thought of as being Coeur d'Alene, but she also name-checked Bessie Smith and Ethel Waters as stylistic inspirations. Was there ever any clarity about Robbie Robertson's indigenous roots relative to Americana music? Pat and Lolly Vegas of Redbone first hit the scene doing surf music and Richie Valens inflected Latin music. The style argument tempts us, and it surely tempted the filmmakers, but in the end, it more often points and more powerfully points to the ambiguities of cultural production itself, full of crossings and influence and unconscious plagiarisms. So I've scrambled the order of these analytics because it is the complexities of the representation argument that haunt Rumble and any reconsideration of contemporary Native cultural production in the years that have followed. These representational politics involve a kind of recursive dynamic. Indian people observe American culture, especially the moments when white Americans are observing them, and they craft self-images and performance to speak back to and through and with that culture. American cultural production then takes these indigenous performances, and just like a mapping app on your phone, when you get on the wrong street, it starts recalculating. It produces new old ideas in the way that any articulation of culture simultaneously transforms what came before and reproduces it. And so these cagey native cultural crossers and shapers observe the new elements, and they respond accordingly. And the dialectic continues. The dynamic I'm laying out here has been captured by the Anishinaabe writer and literary critic Gerald Vizenor, who described it with a word, survivance, borrowed from an old English legal tradition. At its simplest level, in the way that most people end up using it, survivance is read as an amalgam of survival and resistance. To resist is to survive is to resist. But Vizenor is after something much more complicated than that. Indian, for him, is a term that can only reflect a colonial consciousness shared between colonizers and native people. It's the container of all the bad imaginaries, the secret desires and racist repulsions, the red skin and savagery, the dum-dum-dum-dum-dum-dum-dum on a descending minor third and a Scottish snap, all of that stuff. The warrior of, that's my music riff, right? The warrior of survivance, he insists, must be post-Indian, aware of everything in that container, willing to work and rework it, and so demonstrating a mastery over new kinds of narratives, stories that speak to a native audience with wit, courage, humor, endurance, and that speak at the same time to those non-native audiences craving the Indian. Vizenor's post-Indian warriors of survivance are cagey. They might make that non-native audience think that they are getting what they want when they're getting something different and altogether else. The warrior of survivance does not give up and is powered by a smooth sense of irony. For where is irony more present than among those who have suffered the hurts of history while living in a world that denies both hurt and history? It's where native humor and other humor originates. So was Link Wray a post-Indian warrior of survivance? I don't know. The sonic world of the power chord has, from his moment on, been expressive of a certain, you know what I mean to say, right? A certain kind of fuck off, right? To the world as it is, right? An anti-colonial kind of strategy, right? And that sounds about right. But, maybe he was just a rebel without a cause. He was pretty happy to present in a kind of James Deansian mode. And what about Jesse Ed Davis? He might be a better case with his leather jacket, his occasional headband, his great hair, his sense of ironic humor, and perhaps most of all, his collaboration with John Trudell, who definitely was a post-Indian warrior of survivance. Well, I think the survivance case is strong for Mary Sully. She watched America closely, grasped it, reworked it, processed it, spit it back out in the form of art. And that art has a politics visible in images such as these. I'm just going to show you a couple more of these. This is the Indian church, it's Bishop William Hobart Hare. He was the Episcopal, he's the diocese bishop of the Niobrara Missionary District in South Dakota. They called him Zitkan Duzahan, traveling bird, flying bird. And in fact, what you can see is her doing a kind of punning thing here, where a cross has its wings clipped to become a bird and has its legs spread to become a man, and looms over this camp with a kind of black shadow. It's a pretty ambiguous kind of image. Or this one, the Indian church, where she's making another punning kind of argument, right, where the arms of a priest are actually holding out this purple robe, but it looks like the entrance to a teepee with these teepee flaps, and who's entering? All these native women of different tribes are coming and going around the edges of this, reflecting the fact that native women are the ones who power this native church. And then this one, Indian history. This is the one that I see the Aaron Douglas Diego Rivera tradition kind of taking shape, where we can see a kind of idyllic world, the world of the reservation, the modernist figures of anxiety that we would see in kind of Aaron Douglas's work, or Jacob Lawrence even, and then these kind of crushing feet. Then they're sort of squashing the aspirations of Native people. All these things turning into these sort of interestingly curious bands, and then here being flipped on its side, right? And an affirmative statement of nativeness. Here's the feet pressing down. Here's the modernist figures of anxiety, all abstracted. Here's the barbed wire of history. And here's the four colors of the parfleche tradition, right? Sort of overriding those kinds of things. Rumble, it will not surprise you to learn, was made by fans. The Mescalero Apache guitarist about town, Stevie Salas, was the executive producer and one of the most important closing faces in the film. It meant that there were native musicians and musics that ended up on the cutting room floor, daring us to imagine a Rumble 2.0. Such a film, by cutting a wider swath through historical memory, might make a better case for reclamation, for style, for innovation, for the complex representational labor of survivance music. And I think there's a long list of 2.0 candidates, ranging from the almost famous to the everyday. The Cherokee swing fiddler and sadly convicted murderer, Spade Cooley, Con Muskogee saxophonist Jim Pepper, whose beautiful rendition of a peyote song, Wichitaito, has been rightly covered multiple times. The Santee musician and record label owner Tom B. of the 1970s band XIT, mysterious, uniquely voiced Cherokee folk singer Karen Dalton, South Dakota music teacher and powwow jazz saxophonist Frederick Whiteface, many musicians and bands who came out of the boarding school tradition or system, in which the specials, right, art, music, and PE, often offered solace to beleaguered students. It's well worth remembering those reservation marching bands, wind ensembles, and occasional headdress-wearing string quartets of the early 20th century. Shockingly, to me at least, it has now been 2 decades since I tried to trace the sound of Indian as it appeared in Indigenous composers such as Charles Wakefield Cadman, Arthur Farwell, Charles Sanford Skilton, and then tried to follow Native American performers who worked out of those traditions. Chinina Blackstone, Princess Watawasso, Irene Easton, Askananton, and others. A Rumble 2.0 might reimagine the decolonization and indigenization of the ethnomusicological archive, recalling that Native peoples continue to make music by, for, and of themselves as sustaining lifeways. It would be able to revisit popular music genres, digging deeper into such phenomena as Navajo metal bands and, the big absence in the film, the prevalence of hip-hop across Indian country. A filmmaker might explore, say, the metacritical skills of the snotty-nosed res kids. Those who know these folks will understand. Yeah, Sirian, I see you nodding out there, right? Which could be nicely paired with the Indian humor of Sterling Harjo's Reservation Dogs, or the futurist practice of the Oglala artist Kite, which combined body interface, machine learning, and embroidered forms of notation. Such a film would necessarily turn to figures such as Brent Michael Davids and the Pulitzer Prize-winning composer-performer Raven Chacon, the jazz trumpeter Delbert Anderson. The list is actually too long to keep recounting. And this music in our updated film would unfold, I think, in happy tandem with other forms of Native cultural production and offer hope, and maybe even a good case, that we've landed on a plateau rather than a cresting wave headed for a trough. There have been Indians all over the screen, and in very good ways, not just Reservation Dogs, but Dark Winds, Rutherford Falls, Prey, Killers of the Flower Moon, Native film producers such as those of the Chickasaw Nation. Native visual and literary artists are everywhere, marked perhaps most vividly by Choctaw artist Jeffrey Gibson's solo exhibition at the American Pavilion at the Venice Biennale this past year, Kent Monkman's massive canvases at the Met, and the recent MacArthur fellowships awarded to Gibson, Chacon, Natalie Diaz, Sterling Harjo, Wendy Red Star, Larissa Fasthorse, and Robin Wall Kimmerer. These are only a few of the people that Vizenor might name as post-Indian survivance warriors. Well, I might say more to celebrate this cultural moment, but it is unfortunately a political moment as well, one that carries a certain educational burden, and I hope you will bear with me for 4 more minutes. Thank you. In September 2018, the previous Trump administration removed federal trust status from the land held by and for the Mashpee Wampanoag tribal nation. Accompanying this move was a gesture to the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, with the suggestion that Native American people, defined as one among many racial groups within the United States, was receiving undue and therefore unequal and therefore unfair rights relative to other groups. It seems likely that similar things will happen in the next years, and I would like to make sure that musicologists, among others, have a basic grounding in the facts. Nestled within the United States Constitution is an Indigenous Constitution with 3 articles. The 3/5 Clause, that famous North-South political compromise that counts enslaved people as 3/5 of the person, that clause also writes Indian people into the Constitution, names them in order to write them out of it. Indians not taxed are not to be counted in American censuses. And why? Because the authors recognized Indian nations as separate and distinct political bodies. The second Indigenous article can be found in the Commerce Clause, in which Congress is tasked with regulating commerce with foreign nations among the several states and with the Indian tribes. If you are parsing the grammar, as our originalist judges claim to want to do, you will see that Native people are again framed as being outside the United States. The proper relation with these Native nations then was the same as it would be with France and Great Britain. Distinct nations negotiated treaties with one another. And that, as we know, is what the United States did. And so the third article of the Indigenous Constitution is the Supremacy Clause, which states that among the various bodies of law in this country, 3 will be superior: the Constitution, the laws made by Congress under the Constitution, and the treaties which had been or would be signed. These things create a foundation for understanding that American Indians are not simply another racial group. They are political bodies that have long existed in treaty relations with the federal government. In 1831, in the case Cherokee Nation v. Georgia, the Supreme Court invented, out of whole cloth, a new status for tribal nations, who are now deemed to be domestic dependent nations. They were thought to be wards of the federal state, learners in a state of pupillage with the United States as the teacher and as their trustee. Indeed, this case, along with many others, created a complicated situation because the United States asserted itself as the trustee of native lands and resources, with the legal obligation to be a good trustee. In a case the following year, the court went some way towards reversing itself, recognizing the original tribal sovereignty first codified in the Constitution. And indeed, when you look at the 14th Amendment, with its powerful language of due process and equal protection, you will find a reaffirmation of the same exclusion found in the 3/5 Clause. Skipping over lots of history and many, many legal cases, I will close by pointing you to the 1974 Supreme Court decision in Morton v. Mancari, an employment discrimination case concerning racial preferences in hiring at the Bureau of Indian Affairs. The court held again that Indian people were not a racial group in this context, but had a political status, the result of a long history of political relations with the United States. And so today, Native people live within what we can think of as a trust sovereignty paradox. They are both sovereign nations within the American political structure, federal, state, local, tribal, and the United States continues to owe and to assert a trust responsibility. So that Indian land, such as that of the Mashpees, is held by the government in trust. What's coming for Native people over the next years will be a brazen attempt to destroy both the long-standing trust obligation of the federal government and the very notion of tribal sovereignty. There will be much talk of special rights and fair play and equal protection. These things will sound high-minded, but they will not be. They will aim to make Native people a racial group only and deny these distinctive political status tribal nations have held within this country from its very beginning. So please, my friends, when you hear that high-minded talk and think that maybe it sounds reasonable, please remember tonight, these words will be a betrayal of over 2 centuries of American history. Well, one of the people making this argument during the Red Power era was my father, Vine Deloria Jr. On November 12, 2005, 19 years and 2 days from tonight, I was giving a talk at the Chicago Humanities Festival. My dad had struggled with his health that fall. That night, my mom called to tell me he was in the hospital and he was probably not going to make it. I caught the first plane, raced through the rental car line in Denver. I was on my way to the hospital when she called me to tell me that he had just passed. So tonight and this weekend, I have sad memories of November in Chicago. A sense of obligation, as I hope I've just shown you, to carry on some part of his work. And a reminder of how much music, the guitar stuff more than the trombone stuff, actually meant to him. Like many music performance majors, I recognized in my sophomore year of college a very hard truth, that talent comes in measures, and mine was never going to be sufficient to make a life in music. It is one of my greatest regrets of my life. I was not alone in turning to a different recognition of the importance of the many music teachers in my life, people who were and are role models for rigor, discipline, nurture, joy, and a rich emotional life. For 2 years, I taught band and orchestra and general music at Cherry Creek West Middle School in Colorado. The circle had turned, and I was now the guy trying to convince trumpet players to take up trombones, baritones, and tubas, and the clarinet and flute sections to try the oboe, or even, dare I say it, the bassoon. Seeking adventure, I left that job, played in a couple bands, had fun, and learned the lesson about my insufficiency of talent yet again in a different context. Passed through broadcast journalism, into American studies, and on to my first academic job at the University of Colorado, where my father and I shared the same office for a year. And yes, it was weird. But he still liked to holler at me. If you can actually play that thing, play Wildwood Flower. Somewhere in there was when I started keeping a guitar next to my own desk and inviting curious students to play something. Today, much to my surprise, I find myself writing about art and Native nations, and occasionally about music, and to my great astonishment, speaking tonight to the American Musicological Society. I do so with humility. I want to thank you all so much for the invitation to share. I very much look forward to attending the rest of the meeting, learning things, and making yet another and different kind of return to the world of music. Thank you all so much.